Confronted my manipulative parents about how they destroyed our family, revealing their schemes, and now I'm facing threats and chaos. I'm a 22-year-old guy living in a small South Asian country that's famous for a certain beverage. My family is a big deal around here. Both my mom and dad, who are 49, come from some of the most renowned business families in the country, and they're both the sole heirs of their respective families' legacies. Their marriage was more of an arrangement decided by my grandparents, who married them off right after they finished their ALS. They were just 19. Within a year, my brother, Mike, was born. A few years later, I came along. After Mike was born, my parents went off to university. Dad got involved with the family business, but mom never worked a day. Her world is all about charities, galas, high teas, and parties. Growing up in that household, I barely remember either of my parents actually being present in our lives. In fact, I realized over time that they never really saw Mike and me as people but as assets, things to show off or barter for their own advantage. Because of that, Mike, who's 6 years older than me, became my real family. Honestly, he was my father, my mother, my everything. I still have this vivid memory from when I was 4 and seriously ill. Mike was only 10. Our driver took us to the hospital, but not once did my parents visit. My grandmother came a couple of times, but it was Mike, just a kid himself, who stayed at my side, looking after me the whole time. On my first day of school, while the other kids went in holding their parents' hands, it was Mike who led me to my classroom. He was a student there too. I remember bursting into tears, clinging to him, and he comforted me the best he could. Though he got punished for being late to his own class, he never complained. Mike was the best brother anyone could imagine. Always helping me, always supporting me. We both attended one of the country's top schools, and Mike was the kind of son every parent here dreams of. Tall, handsome, and calm, always wearing this big, charming smile that drew people in. He was so thoughtful, always thinking before acting, usually the mediator in any conflict, but I saw him fight once, and, wow, that was something else. He was brilliant in academics, sports, and extracurriculars, adored kids, and steered clear of smoking and drinking, which is a big deal in my country. Even in our business family, there's a hard no alcohol before 18 rule, but Mike still doesn't drink to this day. He was captain of his sports team, played for the under-19 national team for a while before stepping away to focus on his education. I, on the other hand, was the rebel. In my early teens, I started spiraling, but Mike found out and pulled me out of that downward slide. To be honest, if it wasn't for him, I honestly think I could have ended up in jail or worse. Mike was popular, handsome, talented, wealthy, and kind. Everyone wanted to be around him, especially girls, but I always noticed he would politely turn them down. I never understood why at the time. Here, our education system is divided between ordinary levels and advanced levels. You need to pass O levels to move on to A levels, and only if you clear those can you get into university. My father wanted Mike to stick with business-related subjects, but Mike's dream was to become a doctor. One monumental fight later, Mike managed to negotiate with my dad, promising he would enter the business eventually, after working as a doctor for a while. Dad agreed on the condition that he wouldn't pay for Mike's studies or expenses, not a huge issue, since education is free here, so Mike had to work part-time. After his exam results, Mike rented an apartment closer to his job. I'd visit him often, sometimes unannounced, and I was always welcome. One day, when I was 14, I decided to pop over unexpectedly. What I saw that day changed everything. I walked in and saw Mike on the sofa with another man, Jake, both of them shirtless, kissing each other passionately. Jake was another national-level sportsman, a heartthrob in his own right, and captain of one of the most popular sports teams in the country. I was shocked. My country is deeply conservative when it comes to homosexuality. It's just not something that's talked about, let alone accepted. I didn't know what to think or how to react. Mike was my role model, my father figure, and suddenly I was confronted with something I'd only ever heard described in negative, stereotypical terms. I was upset, confused, and, honestly, disgusted. I wandered for hours not knowing what to do. It's not easy to admit, but at the time, I was homophobic. I had never been exposed to any other point of view. Our culture just shut the conversation down before it started. Jake found me eventually and took me back to the apartment. That night, we talked everything through. They explained different sexualities to me, what it meant, and went awkwardly into discussions about safe sex. It was as technical and clinical as it gets. Mike was a medical student, Jake was an engineering student, and suddenly my universe had expanded in a way I wasn't prepared for. But after that conversation, I accepted it because I loved my brother more than anything. Fast forward 6 years, Mike and Jake both graduated at the top of their classes, found jobs, and settled into their new lives together. That's when things exploded. Our parents somehow found out about Mike and Jake's relationship, and everything came crashing down. My father threatened to disown Mike, even sent goons after Jake's family. Mike and Jake made the decision to leave the country early, intending to start over somewhere else, but the pressure just kept coming. Eventually, Jake fled to Germany to escape it all. That's when my father arranged a marriage for Mike, with a woman 10 years his senior, Anne, the daughter of a business associate. Mike was against it, but something was off about her. I got a bad vibe right away. Then, At a party, they managed to slip something into Mike's food, this after already trying, unsuccessfully, to spike his drinks, not that they knew or cared much about his habits, apparently. He woke up the next morning next to Anne, both naked. With no way to prove otherwise and his reputation and family standing at risk, Mike was forced to marry her. Mike ended things with Jake over the phone, not wanting to keep Jake as a side hustle while being forced into a marriage he never wanted. He cut off all contact, and it broke his heart. But we figured out it was all a setup. Anne and my dad, it turns out, were having an affair. My dad had always cheated on my mom. Anne was just one in a long line of women. I'd heard rumors before, but whenever I asked Mike about it, he'd steer the conversation away. When I pressed him on why he didn't tell my mom, he said that he'd tried, he believes in fidelity above all else, but every time he brought it up, my mom would accuse him of lying and punish him for it. After a few attempts, Mike just gave up. And that's the reality of my family, my brother, my hero, and the tangled, heartbreaking mess we've all been forced to live with. We gathered all the evidence and filed for divorce. The entire process was brutal. Their main defense was that the child belonged to my brother, but here's the thing, my brother never even had sex with her. She ended up shouting that fact in court, glaring with such fury that it was clear to everyone just how absurd their claim was. When we got the DNA test results, we discovered the truth, the baby was actually our half-brother. Neither Anne's family nor my father wanted custody of the child, so, since he was technically my brother's half-brother, the court decided to give the baby to Mike. This became one of the quickest divorce cases I've ever heard of around here, wrapping up in just about 8 months, even though divorces in my country usually drag on forever. To make matters even more surreal, that woman had been participating in orgies and gangbangs while she was pregnant. The more I learned, the less shocked I became by anything related to her. After the divorce was finalized, Jake found out. He'd been asking me about my brother, and I ended up telling him what happened. I hadn't told Mike that Jake was asking after him. I kept it from my brother, at least for a while. Just last week, Mike left the country for some consultant training, I'm not even totally sure that's the right term, and he took the baby with him. Over there, he reunited with Jake. Honestly, seeing them together made me genuinely happy for them. But what happened yesterday was what triggered everything I wanted to ask about. We were having dinner when my father suddenly proposed the daughter of one of his colleagues as a potential bride for me. At the moment, I'm single, but I already knew that I didn't want anything to do with this girl. Her hobby is literally sleeping around. I'm not one to judge someone for having a high body count, as long as they don't cheat during a relationship, I don't care. But this woman, cheating is actually her thing. So I refused, telling my father that I didn't want to marry a cheater. That's when he blew up, got all defensive, and started making it personal. He said he didn't expect anything better from a son who follows that wth, meaning Mike, who ruined the family name and then destroyed our parents' marriage. He just went off, hurling all sorts of things about Mike, and then insisted I was on a path to become just like him. That's when I lost it. I shouted right back that I'd rather follow in Mike's footsteps than ever become a cheater myself. That sparked an ugly shouting match. My father raged about how Mike's presence had destroyed his social image, how I was becoming an ungrateful son, and how I didn't care at all about my real parents. My anger just boiled over. I unleashed it all, reminded them of every time they failed to show up for us, prioritized parties, girls' nights, or trips with mistresses while we were sick. I told them that no matter how much they provided for us, they only showed interest in being parents when it would benefit them. I said outright that I thought my brother was a better parent than either of them, than someone who snuck overseas with his mistress, or the one who went partying while one of their children was in the hospital with severe pneumonia. I told them they were the ones who truly destroyed our family, not Mike. After that, my father looked absolutely drained and pale, and my mom was sobbing at the kitchen table. I grabbed my things, left the house, and went to Mike's apartment. He'd given me the keys before heading abroad, so I let myself in. Today, the maid called to say my father hasn't left his office and my mother's still crying. I can't find even a trace of guilt in myself for what I said. I just don't. I thought leaving the house would make the next morning easier. It didn't. I woke up to banging on the door. Our maid, slipping past the building's security like she always has, stood there with puffy eyes and kept saying sir, please, sir in that same hushed voice she used to use when we'd get fevers as kids. She said my father hadn't left his office all night and my mother was still crying, and then, an hour later, she called again. My father had collapsed in the lobby of his building. They rushed him to a private hospital. I don't know what came over me, but I showered, put on the first shirt I found in Mike's closet, and went. My mother was alone in the corridor, in a sari that wasn't perfectly pinned for once, hair not set, face empty without makeup. She tried to stand up when she saw me and almost tripped. I grabbed her elbow out of reflex. My father was pale and hooked up to a monitor, the line hopping like a nervous lizard. Mild heart attack, the doctor said. Stress. He wants to see you, my mother whispered, and I almost laughed at the irony of a man who can't stand the sight of his own mess suddenly wanting an audience. I went in. He looked at me like he recognized me and didn't at the same time. His voice was a scratch. You have no right, he started, and then coughed, and then tried again. You think you can speak to me like that? In this country? In this family? There was this tremor in his hands that I had never seen before. He went straight to bargaining. If I apologized and agreed to sit with the colleague's daughter, we could forget everything I said. He actually said, "I will forget this." I told him I wasn't apologizing and I wasn't getting engaged to anyone in his little catalog. He stared at me for a long second. Then he said, like a man who thought he still had every card, "Then you will be cut off from everything." I said okay. He tried a different angle. "Your brother," he said, looking at the window instead of my face, "will come back when I call." I answered, very calmly, that the only thing that would make Mike come back would be a life or death emergency for the baby. He blinked. He didn't know the baby had spiked a fever the night before and Jake had slept on the floor because the little guy would only calm down if Mike stood and swayed. While I was standing in that room, my phone buzzed with a photo of Mike shirtless, hair a mess, the baby asleep on his chest, Jake's arm thrown over both of them, the caption, "Survived our first long night." When I stepped out, our old driver was sitting on one of the waiting area chairs. He retired last year. I didn't even know he knew how to get to this end of town. He motioned me over like we were in a spy movie and took a greasy old feature phone out of his pocket. "Sir," he said, looking at the floor, "I recorded something." "Not then, before. After that party." He said he'd answered a late-night call from my father and picked up and from a guest house. He'd put the phone on record and left it in the cup holder because he was scared of getting blamed for something someday, and because he'd noticed the pattern. He said he couldn't sleep thinking about it anymore. He tapped the phone like it was alive. "Your brother is a good boy," he said. "You are also a good boy. Don't let them finish you." I sat in the hospital lobby listening to my father and Ann on a scratchy recording talk about the spice and how if the idiot won't drink we'll put it in food. "Do you not have brains?" And then laughing, this ugly, soft laugh I have never heard my father use with anyone else. It was the first time in a long time I felt actually cold. I took that phone straight to our grandfather's old lawyer, the one who does wills and bored old man paperwork and keeps his pens in a blue glass mug shaped like a fish. He looked at me as if I was still that kid who sat on his office floor playing with paper clips while Mike signed school forms. I played the recording. He didn't interrupt. When it ended, he sighed and said, "You will not survive this alone." He took the phone, made copies to a USB like he'd been waiting to do this his whole life, and told me to leave and let him run a few errands. I stepped out of his office and two men in cheap suits were leaning against a white van with tinted windows, pretending to smoke. They looked at me like they were bored of waiting. I went right back into the office. The lawyer didn't even blink. He picked up his phone, dialed someone, and in 3 minutes a police jeep pulled up. The men disappeared. "You have to be smarter than your father," the lawyer said, more to himself than to me. I went back to Mike's apartment and found the front door ajar. That was the moment my stomach actually dropped. There was a man with his back to me in the living room, leafing through a stack of documents I'd left on the coffee table. He turned when he heard me and I recognized him, the head of security for my father's office. We've exchanged nods since I was a child. He looked at me and then at the pile, and I could swear something like pity flicked across his face. He didn't move. "I don't get paid enough for prison," he said, and walked past me, out the door, leaving the folder on the table. Inside was a copy of a court petition for a travel ban on me, already stamped by a judge whose daughter I sat behind in grade 8. There was also an invitation card, heavy paper, gold leaf border, for tea at my grandmother's house. The handwriting was my mother's. "Please come. 7 p.m. He wants to talk." I didn't go home. I went to my grandmother's. She was in the veranda arranging flowers like she always does, in a white cotton blouse and one of those old sarongs she ties herself. She didn't say hello. She asked if I wanted tea and then, without looking up, asked, "Are you carrying anything that makes a noise?" I put the USB on the table. She laughed, just a small breath. She called in her accounting guy, this old man with a notebook that has everyone's birthdays and exam results and blood types written down, and told him to call an emergency board meeting. "Not tomorrow. Now," she said. "They have turned this house into a garbage pit. It ends." She told me she had redrawing rights over some of the shares and that she'd been waiting to see if either of her children would grow up. She said she was done waiting. She told me to sit and drink my tea. My mother arrived 20 minutes later. Her eyes were red. She hugged my grandmother without asking, the way a child does. She saw me and started to cry again, but not that loud, performative crying she does when people are watching. This was silent and ugly. She told me she'd kept pretending because the alternative would have meant leaving the house her father built, leaving her social circle, leaving everything, and she didn't know how to be poor. I told her she wouldn't have been poor. She stared at me like I was missing the point. "You don't understand," she said, placing her hand on the arm of the cane chair, "what people in this city do to women like me who leave." It wasn't an excuse, and I told her so. It was the closest we have ever come to a conversation. Halfway through this, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered and heard a timid male voice, a waiter from the hotel where that party happened. He said he had been contacted by a man to swap plates, and that he'd been paid through a courier so there's no transfer trail, but he had CCTV footage of the kitchen that night, saved on his own because he got blamed for a missing cake the month before and wanted leverage if he ever needed it. He didn't want money. He wanted protection because he was suddenly being followed on his bus route. He said he would only hand the footage to me or my lawyer in public, in daylight, with people around. I set a time at the biggest coffee shop in the city where there are always 5 influencers taking photos of their lattes. He showed up with a battered laptop and headphones. We watched my brother's plate being switched by a man in a charcoal suit whose face you saw only in profile, my father's driver at the time, and a thin woman in a red sari standing to the side, nodding. Not Anne. My father's PA. The one who sends me reminder, dentist 3:30 p.m. texts sometimes. The lawyer didn't waste a minute. He filed a complaint. He attached the audio, the video, the phone logs he pulled with some trick I don't want to know about, and a sworn statement from the waiter. He didn't even tell me the judge. He muttered something about sending it to someone who still believes in exams. By the time I got back to my grandmother's, 2 uniformed officers were standing at our gate, looking at the peacocks. My father wasn't arrested. He's still in a hospital bed, but the warrant has his name on it. Suddenly, phones across this stupid city started buzzing. You could feel it, the panic of people who thought this kind of thing only happened to others. I should say that in the middle of all this, Mike called. He called because he'd felt something, because he still checks on me the way a parent checks on a teenager who insists he's fine. I told him as much as I could, and he went quiet for a long time. I don't want you burned, he said. Promise me you're not doing this to punish them. Promise me you're doing this to stop them from hurting anybody else. Jake came into the frame and took the baby, who was trying to eat Mike's hair. We just registered a civil partnership, Jake said, grinning like a schoolboy. He held up a ring that looked like he got it out of a vending machine. He made me sign a document about guardianship in case a bus hits him, he added, rolling his eyes, and then he got serious and said, be careful. The board meeting at my grandmother's lasted 3 hours. People who have never told my father no in their lives suddenly remembered how to read the Companies Act. My grandmother's voice didn't shake once. She moved to suspend my father from his positions pending investigation. She moved to appoint an interim chair. She moved to split certain decision-making powers to a committee chaired by her and, this was the part that made me feel dizzy, she said she wanted me and Mike named to it. Someone objected. She raised an eyebrow that could slice glass. Objecting died in the throat. When it was over, she put her hand on mine and said, they will try to make you feel like you are doing something unnatural. You are not. You are the natural consequence. I went back to Mike's apartment to try to sleep in a bed that smells like my brother's shampoo and Jake's cologne and baby powder. There was a brown envelope on the floor inside the door, no postage. Inside, another copy of the travel ban application and, stapled to it, a temporary travel restriction order stamped at 4:17 p.m. These people really don't rest. There was also a square of paper with my father's handwriting on it, the same handwriting that signed our school leave excuses. It said, come tomorrow. We finished this quietly. I stood there holding it and the only thing I could think was that there is nothing quiet left in this. Not anymore. I didn't sleep. I sat with the note and the travel restriction order like 2 snakes on the table and waited for the sun to make everything look less like a trap. It didn't. I texted the number my father had sent the driver with years ago, the one that always forwards to whatever phone he's using. I wrote, I'll come. Hospital. Conference room. My lawyer will be there. If you try quiet, bring paper. The hospital had that disinfectant smell that lives in the back of your throat. The conference room was a rectangle of glass and air conditioning. He had a drip stand and a cardigan over his shoulders like an old professor. There was a woman I didn't know sitting at the corner with a folder and a rubber stamp in front of her. Not blindfolded, sadly, just another notary who has forgotten what the law is supposed to do. He started as if the night in his office had been a nap, as if there weren't 2 policemen outside his door pretending to watch cricket highlights on a phone. No more theatrics, he said, voice steady enough to live on television. He slid a bundle across the table. It was thick paper, cream, gold edges. It smelled like perfumed stationery and bad decisions. The top page said undertaking in a font I've only ever seen on wedding cards. It wanted me to withdraw the complaint against the PA and others unknown, accept that certain misunderstandings occurred, and agree that any further issues would be handled within family. It also wanted me to affirm that my brother consented to nuptials and, astonishingly, that he had consummated the marriage, like we were signing something in the year 1840. At the back was a list of assets, an empty plot in a place where nobody wants to live, an allowance, a car, and a job title with no power attached to it like a crown made of paper. Sign, he said. He pushed a pen toward me. It was one of those heavy ones with a gold nib and a thin film of something on the grip. The notary cleared her throat. My mother sat on the other side of him with her hands folded so tight her knuckles were white. She was wearing sunglasses indoors. The thing about being raised by a man like my father is you do inherit some skills. I didn't touch the pen. I opened my own folder and pulled out my phone, pressed record, and put it face down. You will put the words mouth and spice and that party into the air, I said, and we can talk about signatures. He smiled, slow, like a cat that's found a mouse already missing a foot. You think anything will stand, he said softly, leaning back so his cardigan slipped off one shoulder. You think you understand this game. You are a child. You are a child who has no idea how deep the ground is. Then he did the thing I needed him to do. He talked. He didn't say spice, because he's not stupid, but he said if the fool refuses a glass, use a plate, and then he said, why do you think we pay people to carry plates? He laughed the same laugh I'd heard on the driver's recording, the soft one, like he was stirring tea. He glanced up at the notary and she looked at the table like it was a window. He said names in that lazy way that sounds like a mistake if you play it back for someone who wants to keep sleeping. He said the judge's nickname, the one only his golf friends use. He said, your brother was made a man that night whether he liked it or not, and, my mother flinched so hard the chair scraped. I stood up. We're done, I said, and when he said you can't walk away from me in this country, I said, watch me. He moved as if to stand and the drip tugged and the monitor beeped fast, and for one tiny second, I saw the mask slip. He was old. It didn't stop what he is, but it made it look human. There was a policeman waiting in the corridor pretending to drink bad coffee. My lawyer had been in the room the whole time, half a shadow, his pen scratching dates. He looked at me like we'd just caught the biggest fish in a dirty lake. Don't touch anything he gives you, he murmured, as if I needed telling. On my way down in the elevator, a man in a black shirt with a badge I didn't recognize put a paper in my hand. Different stamp, same dignity. It was an ex-party petition to appoint a temporary guardian for the baby. It used words like immediate danger and moral contamination and said my brother had removed a minor from jurisdiction. It was signed at 10:12 a.m. by a judge who once gave a speech about protecting tradition at a school prize giving. My grandmother's name was on page 5, listed as interested party. I didn't even wait for the elevator doors to open properly. I called the lawyer. He said bring it, and then, almost gently, don't drive your car. I took a tuk-tuk that smelled like stale incense and diesel and went straight to the fish mug office. He scanned everything, his old hand steady, and called someone whose ringtone was the national anthem, which would have been funny if this wasn't my life. He filed a writ challenging the order on a technicality I didn't understand and a principle I did. You can't pretend a court didn't already decide custody because you regret your deal. He also called a friend at the passport office, the one with a mustache like a broom, and the mustache man called back and said, they tried. I told them this is not a grocery list. I was on my way to my grandmother's when the PA called me. I almost didn't answer. I picked up and heard traffic, horns, and someone breathing too fast. Please, she said. I want to tell you. I can't sleep. I told her to meet me at the little clinic behind the bus depot where nobody ever looks up from their phones. She came in with a scarf over her hair like she was hiding from rain and took it off and I saw the purple under one eye, faded but real. She put a cheap phone on the steel table between us like it was a bomb. There were messages. Not the kind you can explain away with it was a joke on a good day. From my father's number, the one he used 2 numbers ago, the one that stopped working the week after the party. Kitchen camera is blind spot, ask waiter number 3 to carry, one of them said. Spice and tiffin. Not too much, keep him vertical. Another was just a photo of a plate with a sprig of coriander and the words this one. The PA didn't look at me while I read. He said he would send me to Dubai, she whispered. He said it would be a year. I am 38. I am still here. The lawyer came and took the phone without touching any screen with his fingers, using a pencil like it was a snake. He asked her if she wanted money or safety. She said, I want to not die, which is not a thing a person should have to say in a clinic with a cartoon lion on the wall. We drove her straight to my grandmother's house. My grandmother put her in the back room in the annex where the old sewing machine is and told the cook to say there were rats if anyone asked about noise. While we were in the car, the head of security texted me from a number he must have bought that morning. They will try to move the small phone from the office safe tonight, he wrote. It has voices that don't like daylight. He sent me a code for the safe that looked like a date, and then he added, I am not a hero. The lawyer called the officer who likes peacocks. He got a warrant with the speed of someone who owes their career to my grandfather and is trying to pay the debt like a human being. We went to the office at 9 p.m., when the guards are usually asleep in their plastic chairs. Not that night. There were 3 of them and they stood 2 straight. The officer walked in like he owned the building and said, if you even touch your belt, I will make you famous. He cracked the safe, and for a second I thought the old man had been romantic. There were photos, letters from a time when people put ink on paper because they believed in forever. Then, behind that, a stack of discs in cheap plastic covers and a phone with no casing. They bagged everything. There were voice notes. You could hear the clink of cutlery, the hum of air conditioning in a very expensive restaurant, the way the voices tried to be lazy and failed. My father. Anne, a man whose voice I know from the evening news, talking about how courts are courts but this is our country, and someone tapping a glass for quiet like he was making a toast at a wedding. My lawyer listened with that expression he gets when he's about to write a letter that will make someone perspire. On the way back, I saw the white van with the tinted windows in the rearview mirror of the tuk-tuk. It wasn't pretending to smoke this time. It followed us past the coffee shop, past the petrol shed where the man with 3 teeth waves at everybody. When we pulled into the lane to my grandmother's, it kept going. 3 minutes later, my old car, which I hadn't driven since morning, honked downstairs like a relative. I live in a country where cars honk without driving, and thieves say hello first. The head of security called again. Don't touch your car, he said. They put a parcel. They think police is on their side. He was breathing like he'd run. Keep your hands in front of you when the police come. It is important whose fingerprints. The Peacock officer sent 2 constables who actually wore gloves and didn't roll their eyes when I told them to take prints. They pulled a little packet from under the back seat, clear and neat, like a gift. It looked like powder you use to clean a sink. The officer looked at it and then at me and said, "You have clever enemies," which is a compliment in my city. He took it and, for the first time in my life, I let a police jeep out of my sight with something that could have put me in a cell. Mike called while I was standing under my grandmother's mango tree, which is older than most marriages I know. He didn't say hello. "Don't be alone," he said, and then, because he can't help himself, the baby said ba and we're fighting over whether he means bottle or baba. Jake yelled something about a victory dance from the kitchen. I told Mike about the guardianship petition. He was quiet in that way I remember from nights when we were boys and the power went out and he'd count in his head to keep me occupied. "I will speak to the embassy," he said. "I will speak to my hospital. I will not come back because a man waved paper. The baby is safe." I told him about the PA and the phone. He said my name like a prayer and a warning. At 7 a.m., my grandmother put on a white blouse she saves for funerals and board meetings and walked into the office like a storm in sandals. She called my father by his first name. She said words I didn't think she knew: derivative suit, fiduciary duty, interim relief. People who have spent 20 years perfecting the art of nodding started flipping through acts like they were cookbooks. She signed a resolution suspending my father from all executive powers pending the outcome of the criminal case and the internal inquiry. She appointed an interim CEO whose biggest crime so far has been boring people at dinner. She took back signing authority on the main accounts. She said, without moving any muscles in her face, "If anyone tries to move money today, I will treat it as theft." My mother came with a suitcase. Not the big one she takes to Dubai, a small one, the color of old rose, the kind you can carry yourself. She wore cotton and no makeup and her hair was tied in a way I've only seen in old photographs of her before she married. She didn't say she was leaving. She just put the suitcase in my grandmother's room and sat on the floor next to the bed like a child in trouble. When the cook brought stringhoppers, she ate with her hands and cried without sound. At noon, the mustache man called back to say someone had tried to cancel the baby's passport through ministerial discretion. He said he sent them the custody order and a photo of the baby's vaccinations and wrote "no jurisdiction" in big letters because sometimes you have to talk to power the way power talks to you. The lawyer got an interim stay on the guardianship petition. He walked out of court smiling like he was tasting good mango. At 3, a man from a gossip site called me and asked for a quote. I hung up. At 3:30, 2 officers came to the hospital with a piece of paper and a way of standing that said they were not going to be moved by nurses. They didn't arrest my father. They informed him, formally, that he was not to leave the country and that his passport was to be surrendered by 6 p.m. His face did not do anything you could call emotion. He said, "Do you know who I am?" And the younger officer, who looked like he could be my classmate, said, "Yes. That is why we are here." At 5, the head of security sent me a photo from a stairwell camera in our old house, a man I recognize, from the van and another person I couldn't place walking up to my room. The image is grainy like rain. They came out 5 minutes later carrying nothing. He captioned it, "They didn't find the parcel because I moved it to under seat. I am finished now." He put a smiley face that made me want to put my head through the wall. At 6:30, I went back to the hospital because the note said 7 and I've spent my life showing up for people who don't deserve it. The policemen from earlier were gone. You can't postcard to a man who hasn't been charged when there are only so many bodies for so many posts. There was a different nurse, one with a name tag that read a name my school register had 3 of. My father's door was closed. I knocked and walked in. He was standing, in a shirt, the drip gone. The cardigan was on the back of a chair. His bag was open on the bed. My mother was in the corner, hands twisted in her sari. There was another man in the room, a face from billboards, the kind of man who appears on stage with microphones and calls people my brothers and sisters. They all turned like this was a play and I'd missed my cue. "We can still do this," my father said, and his voice was like water poured over stones. "We keep the company. You keep your brother. We send the girl too," he gestured vaguely, "somewhere. You will be very comfortable." The billboard man smiled at me like an uncle. "Don't make an enemy out of family," he said. "It's expensive." He put a hand on my shoulder without asking. It took everything in me not to shake it off like a dog shaking off a bad smell. I walked to the window and put my phone on the sill, face down. "I don't want your company," I said to the glass. "I want the baby to grow up in a world where men like you are a cautionary tale." The billboard man stopped smiling, just a millimeter. My father's jaw moved once. My mother said my name and it sounded like she had swallowed a stone. He reached for the bag. I stepped forward and pulled it. The zip was open enough for anyone to see the passports, the cash, the bottle of pills that looked like the hospital's and weren't. I looked at the politician, the one who can make phones ring in offices I can't even think about entering, and he looked back and said, very gently, "Don't do this to your father." The door opened before I could decide if I wanted to throw the bag out of the window just for drama. The Peacock officer walked in with 2 others like he'd finally found a seat on a crowded bus. He didn't look at me or at the billboard man. He looked at my father and said, in the tone of a man ordering tea, "Sir, you are under arrest." It wasn't the movie version. There was no shouting. My father did not go quietly either, he went as if he were going to a meeting that bored him, with his chin slightly higher than it needed to be. The billboard man stepped back like a dancer and walked out without looking like he was leaving, disappeared into the corridor like people do when walls have ears. My mother made a sound I've never heard in any house I've lived in. It wasn't crying. It was something older. The station was a fluorescent hell where men fill out forms as if the ink is their enemy. The lawyer was there with his fish mug and his neat tie, and he did boring, beautiful things with paper while people called people in the corners. My grandmother didn't come. She sent the old driver with a bag of food and a thermos of tea like it was a cricket match and we were on day 4. The PA sat on a plastic chair in the next room, scarf off, shoulders straight. She gave her statement with the voice of someone who has nothing left to lose. The head of security sat outside on the low wall, face in his hands, like a man who knows his children won't go to the schools he'd promised them. At 11, the mustache man sent me a photo of a document I didn't know existed, a deed for a trust my father had set up 3 months ago with a name that looks like a quote from a religious text, the kind of name you give to something you want to sound clean. The beneficiary was not who I thought it would be. It said minor child, male, and then Mike's legal guardian designation. Not the baby. A different name. I read it 3 times. I took it to the lawyer, and he looked at it, whistled with no sound, and said, he has been preparing to throw a baby at a bank. He wrote a note in his own book, "Find trustees," and then he rubbed his eyes. By midnight, they had finished the one thing they could finish. My father's fingerprints were rolled. His passport went into a gray envelope. He called me from the bench where he was sitting between a man who smelled like Eric and a man who looked like an accountant whose office doesn't have a window. He said, very softly, so only I could hear it over the ceiling fan, "The phone you have is not the only phone." I put my own phone on record again and asked, "Where is it?" He smiled like he was back in his office, like the lights weren't flickering above his head. "Why would I tell you that?" When I left the station, there was an envelope tucked under the wiper of a police jeep like a love letter. Inside, a single photo, grainy, years old, of Mike on a beach I recognize, holding me on his shoulders, legs thin, hair too long, both of us sunburnt and laughing. On the back, in my father's handwriting, "Brothers either drown each other or teach each other to swim." I went home to the annex where the PA was asleep with the scarf over her face and my mother was on my grandmother's bed clutching a rosary she hasn't used in a decade, and I sat on the floor next to my grandmother's cane chair and thought about water. The phone buzzed at 2:14 a.m. a number with no name. A video, 5 seconds, my father's office, the night of the party, the driver's hands, the waiter's face, the thin woman in the red sari, and then the camera swinging to a corner where I've never looked in my life and catching, just before it fuzzes, my father's friend from the golf course putting a small black phone into the false bottom of the Jimmy drawers.